This episode is a little bit different. It may be one of the most personally valuable podcasts to me that I ever do. It's about my grandpa, LeRoy Benjamin Hazlett, and his journey through World War II, as told by his daughter and my aunt, Marsha Miller. Let's begin. When I was growing up in Kansas City, I spent a lot of time with my grandpa. He took me on nature walks, pointing out the birds and the animals. He taught me how to tie my shoes, how to tell a time on a clock, and how to read a compass, among many other things. We played baseball for hours together in a backyard. Growing up, there were military medals in a box displayed on the wall of my grandparents' living room, but whenever I asked about them, he'd shake his head, wave his hand dismissively, and make that "ah" sound, and that was that. So I learned not to bring it up. As I got older, I became aware that he'd served in Europe throughout the Second World War and had fought through occupied France and Germany. He'd made it out with his life and a few Nazi relics, including a giant Nazi flag and a German Luger. But he never spoke about his time in the war. Not to me, not ever. To add to this mystery, there is a grainy old black and white picture of my grandpa as a young man in full soldier regalia, leaning casually against a wall and smiling ear to ear. In the picture, he's standing in front of a bombed-out building with a hastily written sign that reads, "Hitler's Home." Needless to say, I was always more than intrigued by the picture and how it came about. And yet, we never talked about it. The closest we ever came was when he taught me to shoot a rifle when I was 6 or 7. I asked him why I needed to learn to shoot, and he replied, "Because it's important." That was that. That's the kind of man that he was, very quiet and very direct. To give you an example of his toughness, on a regular basis I saw him retrieve honey from beehives full of bees with his bare hands. To this day, I still regard him as physically the strongest man that I've ever known. His hands and arms were huge, and there was a raw power to him that was honestly intimidating. To a young boy who loved his grandpa, my grandpa LeRoy was a hero of mine, but also a mystery to me. Especially as I got older, I would wonder, why wouldn't he want to talk about his experiences in the war with me? Surely there had to be an incredible story behind that picture of him in front of Hitler's home. But I knew better than to push it, and it never came up. So this year, nearly 20 years since his passing, I asked my Aunt Marsha if she would discuss his time in the war with me. Marsha is his oldest daughter and has done an extensive amount of research on our family's ancestry and specifically on my grandpa and his time in the war. She graciously obliged, so after Thanksgiving dinner, we set up a few microphones in my parents' dining room and got down to it. Many of the facts and stories Marsha relates in this podcast are things I'm hearing for the first time. The sound of another woman asking questions is my mom, Karen, Marsha's sister and LeRoy's youngest daughter. It was important for me to hear my grandpa's experiences from the war to get a better understanding of him and a better understanding of that time. I just hope that this podcast does him and his service justice. So without further ado, this is my Aunt Marsha Miller recounting my grandfather, LeRoy Benjamin Hazlett's tour of duty through the Second World War.
He actually mustered in, his date of entry was 6 October of 41.
Before Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
He got drafted.
Yes, which is a good place to start because he graduated from high school in 1939, right in the middle of the Depression, and Grandpa he delivered feed for the mill in Dotson, and he got Dad on as a truck driver. Dad actually had been offered, he caddied at the country club, and he had been offered a Evans scholarship to go to Mizzou, and he turned him down because he said school wasn't his thing and he'd rather be home. So he turned him down, but and then he delivered feed, and then as the U.S. got into Lend-Lease in 41, as things were building, they started having drafts, and they had one draft on the radio where they pulled numbers, and everybody got a draft card with a number on it. And the second draft was on October 5th of 41, and Dad's was the second number called on the radio. So the next morning he got up and he drove to Fort Leavenworth and he enlisted because he figured rather than wait for the draft notice, he might have a little more say-so over what he was going to wind up doing if he would go and enlist. So he enlisted, and they gave him like a week or two to go back, and they gave him a week or two to go back and pack up his stuff and show up. And so he did. So the story goes, when he got there, they divided them up into groups. They gave them their packs and their boots and everything, and they said, if you have had swimming lessons, you're over here, and if you've not had swimming lessons, you're over here. Well, he grew up along the Blue River, and he knew how to swim, but he never had lessons. He took them very literally, and so he went with the group that never had lessons. And so the first thing they did was they took one of the poor guys in a pack in his boots, and they shoved him in the pool. And the poor guy was drowning, so Dad shucked his pack and he shucked his boots, and he went in and he dove in and got the guy, and he got him out, and he pushed on the chest, and the water came out, and the drill sergeant comes over and says, "You belong in that line." And that was it. So he was like, he knew right then this was not a logical group of people, because he was expecting somebody to say thank you for saving him, and
you're in the wrong line.
Yeah, you're in the wrong line. Go.
Classic.
So, yeah.
Classic military.
Yeah, it is classic military. But Dad said he knew right there, this isn't what he thought it was going to be. So they shipped him to Fort Lewis, Washington for training. And while he was there, he got jaundice. And he wound up in the hospital, in the medical hospital, for a month. In the meantime, his group shipped out to the Pacific Front. And Pearl Harbor had happened and the war had started, and so everybody went to Pacific, but he was still in the hospital. And so by the time he got out, all his people, his buddies, were gone, and at that point in time, they were deciding what they were going to do about Europe. And so they shipped him to Newport News in Virginia, and they did some training in one of the forts there, and I can't remember which one it is, and put him on a troop ship after they'd done several months of training, and he wound up landing right outside of Casablanca, which is on this map right here, on November 8th of 1942, which was the first day of the European campaign. And because he drove truck, and that's what he went in as, it says he went in as a truck driver light. So he drove light vehicles for them. He was in the second wave that went in that night, and they went in the evening late. So he said he got it on the beach like 10:30, 11 on that day, and drove his little truck on. And Casablanca fell really quickly, and then they went across North Africa, and I think those are the pictures that you have in the album, because they had plenty of time on their hands. And he was still with the truck driving unit at that point in time, but he made friends with the wire guys, the guys who laid wire behind enemy lines. And finally, every day they were playing all kinds of games, craps and gambling and cards and whatever. And whatever the light wire guys did, he preferred to play over what the truck drivers did. And finally, his commanding officer said, why don't you just go over there? And you can go with them. And so that's how he wound up being a wireman, was there. And then they went across through, and there were a few little skirmishes, but not much. He said mostly they were bored, and they ate a lot of sand. And then they went to Tunisia, and they did some more training, and Tunisia fell. And then they went across to Sicily, and Sicily's where the fighting really got interesting, to say the least. And he talked about that and going through in the various campaign there. And then that's where they really understood what combat was, and they realized that they really hadn't been trained well enough to be able to do this. But
was Sicily the first time they saw combat?
Really, well, they saw some light combat in North Africa, but really it was the British had pretty much done, right. They'd taken care of Rommel, and the British pretty much did all of that, and they kind of just came in and cleaned up. And so there wasn't lots going on there.
A picture from both them in North Africa is, they're in front of that little Jeep, it's just interesting. That must have been somewhere around Casablanca, I'd assume.
But you can see they went through Casablanca, Algiers, all the way over here. This book, by the way, is from the 15th.
They came across the ocean?
They came across the ocean from Newport News, Virginia, to Casablanca.
But I mean,
and landed here.
Okay.
And then they drove across all this to Tunisia.
Which is a huge amount of land.
Yes,
that's
it
like
is a large amount.
America,
yeah,
Africa is gigantic.
Right, it is gigantic, and it took them a long time to get across.
Did it?
Yeah.
So he would have gone to Florence, probably.
Well, he didn't get there.
Why not?
Well, because you can see where he went here, and then they put him on a boat, and they came this way.
I read things.
But they saw their first action in Sicily, and from Sicily they went to Salerno, which is a beachhead here
And they were-
outside of Naples.
When they were fighting in Sicily, was it they were fighting Italians or?
No, well, yes, but also Germans, both.
Okay.
They were doing both there, and there's a whole book on Sicily that it's been too long. But when they finally, and they did Palermo, and he said he was very happy finally when they got Palermo, because it took quite a bit to get Palermo into the U.S. and to the Allies' hands. Again, the British tended to lead the way because the British troops were better trained than what the U.S. were.
And they'd been there for a lot longer.
Yes, they had.
A lot longer.
Yes, and so the American soldiers were not battle ready at that point.
Well, that's one thing that we forget about as Americans, that the British have been fighting that war for many years.
Yes.
You know, we came in at the end.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah, because it had been going on since 39 as far as real activity. But they went to Salerno, and then that battle was pretty bloody, and it's one of the reasons why they got their arrowhead, because of going into Salerno. And then they wanted to get Monte Cassino, and which set up in the hills up on top of the mountains, and you probably know the name of the mountains. But the Germans were up there, and they were using it to shoot down anybody, and they figured they had to get Monte Cassino. So it was a huge, long campaign. And what they did was, then once they got into Naples and had a little bit of time to fall back, well, they put them on a boat, and then they took them to Anzio. And Anzio was a beachhead with the idea that they would come in to get possibly Rome, but again, Monte Cassino was going to be their objective. And Anzio, they were sitting ducks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Battle of Anzio is one of the bloodiest battles in American
He
history.
lost a lot of people in his thing.
Because all it was a beachhead. They couldn't move back, and they were up above, and anytime anybody came out, they had bunkers, almost like World War I, where they dug in. And anytime anybody came up, they just picked them off.
Wow.
So they were there several.
How did he escape all that? Do you have any idea?
I think they were there through like December. I know that the battle that he won the Silver Star, was awarded the Silver Star for, was on February 29th of 44.
So very near, well, not very near the
So it was Leap Day.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was Leap Day. And in reading in the book here, and reading in one of the other 15th Infantry Regiment books, it was one of the bloodier battles. And the Germans decided they were going to push them off the beachhead in February, like on the 28th. And they just started a barrage. It was a barrage of everything they could give them to try and push them back into the sea. And they kept trying to push back to get a better stronghold on the beach. And to do that, they had to push forward, which meant they had to send the wire guys out to put wire, because you can't go any further than what your wire is, because they had to get the information to people. And the guys didn't come back. And this is the one that Dad said it was damn foolishness. And so after 8 guys had gone out and they didn't come back, and the wire kept getting broken, Dad finally said, "The hell with it, I'll go." He said it was damn foolishness. He shouldn't have done it, but he did. And he followed the wire a ways, and then he kind of went off to the side to see what they were doing, and he could see where the Germans were breaking the wire. When somebody got to fixing where the wire was, they'd pick them off. And so, there's his buddies dead. And so what he wound up doing is splicing it back about a mile and going back around.
Oh, nice.
And going around and doing it, and then got back, which gave him enough then that they were able to push at least to where he had spliced it. And that's what they put him in for the Silver Star for doing that.
Oh, so that's what he got the Silver Star for, was the wires and
Yes.
Anzio?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, that's what the Silver Star was for.
That's incredible.
Which is what he called damn foolishness.
That's one of the few things I remember him talking about. I feel like I remember him saying that he crawled out there.
Yeah, he crawled. He had to on his belly, because if you stood up, you were gone.
It took a long time.
Yes, it did. Yeah. He was talking in terms of like 8 hours. just to go not very far and to figure out what the heck was going on, and then splicing at one place and going around.
Time to have your life and
Yeah.
immediate danger.
Yeah. But he said, it would rain, and it was, Italy in the winter isn't necessarily snow at that level, but it was more rain, and then the foxholes would fill up, and they were wet and they were cold, and they couldn't really do much with fires even to cook, and it was a mess.
How long were they in Anzio?
I think they were there like 3-4 months.
Really, that long?
Yeah, I think so. I would have to go back and read. Seems to me they went in at the end of 43, and then that battle was in February of 44, and I don't think they took Monte Cassino until like March.
Wow.
So
yeah, that was always one of the most fascinating things to me about him was, obviously he never talked to me about any of this stuff, but I always, had a general sense that he had to see people die and see obviously big battles and things, and to not have, we hear about PTSD so much now. He never showed really any of those symptoms to me. I don't know how it was, for you guys growing up with him closer on to that time, but
Dad was really quiet.
I never saw anything that looked like that. I remember him saying that he was just lucky to have gotten out of that alive, and like every day was good because he was alive and he wasn't wet or cold or in a foxhole. So.
Yeah, that was always the general sense that I got, was that he was very grateful for things.
He was, and so Thanksgiving here it was one of his favorite holidays because it was everything. It was a roof over your head and warmth and a hot meal and family. And as he had those, he was happy.
Sure, yeah, that's pretty much the sense that I got from both him and
Grandma. That's when you live at the subsistence level like that.
Right.
You're just happy to not have to be ducking for cover. I mean, he just always talked about it. He was happy to have a meal that he didn't have to cook in his helmet.
Wow.
I mean, that was a lot of, and sleeping cold on the ground. And I don't think they had any place warm to sleep unless they fell back until they got into France, into some of the barns. There were some, a lot of it was just sleeping out in the open.
Yeah, that's really something we don't ever think about with those types of things, is especially in that time, they didn't have technology with these, blankets and things like that. It's like they're just out there in the elements.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people died from those type of things.
He always said that he was luckier than the guys who were literally on the front line and they were supposed to be shooting and fighting. He was supposed to be behind the lines, and if he kept his head on, and if he had good reconnaissance, then he knew where to go with a wire and get back. It always amazes me. He said he spent about a third of his time behind enemy lines.
Right.
And he never really got to fall back very often. He went in. One of the things I find really interesting here, they talk about he came out at 5'10" and 190 pounds, but he went in. He said he was like 5'7" when he went in, and he grew 2 shoe sizes.
Wow.
And every time he would fall back, they would order him new boots, but they never caught up with him until he got to the end.
Good Lord.
So how he was always having problems with his feet, and he used to scrape the calluses off the bottom of his feet all the time. It all came from the fact that his boots were at least 2 sizes too small, and then once you've been wet that many times, they even shrink more. I mean, they marched. The truck driving left in Africa.
How old was he when he got in the Africa and Italy time? Like, how old?
Well, he was born in 1919, and he landed in Africa in November of 42. Okay. So he was almost 23. He would turn 23 on November 20th, and they landed on November 8th.
Wow.
So he was like 23, 24, 25 when he was over there. And so he was a little bit older than most of the guys. So he had a little bit more, and Dad was always an old soul anyway. I mean, he just, what you saw when you were little was what he was.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just an old soul, and he was logical about things. So he was always kind of the older person in the crew. And that's just, that's who he was.
Yeah, he was always very calm, but I mean, I guess that answers my question of, I've always been really curious on, really honestly, just how he made it through all this. But the wiring explains some of that, if he was behind the front line.
He wasn't up there with the gun shooting at
Right,
people. They
right.
weren't exchanging fire. I would really love to know how many of the guys who landed at Casablanca or just outside of Casablanca on November 8th of 42 made it all the way to the end of the war without having been wounded. I don't think it was a high number. And the wire guys would get picked off a lot. And so he said at the beginning and all the way through there and up Italy and into France, they would always have like a first lieutenant at first coming in, and they would be commanding the wire group. Well, they would get picked off, and then finally the second lieutenant started showing, and then there were no more second lieutenants. And so, when he left, he went out as, let's see, chief wireman. Where is it on here? Field wire chief is what he went out as. And when they finally got into France and there were no more officers to be in charge of the wire group, Dad had been there the longest, and he was still vertical. And he managed not to get shot. Wow. And that was the thing that bothered him most, is when they put him in charge of other guys. Because he always, every one of them that got shot, he took it personally.
Right.
And, he didn't want them to get shot,
Yeah,
obviously.
that's something that I remember my mom telling me, is that he didn't ever want to supervise people in his,
No.
career.
You can't see me shaking my head. It's probably not a good thing.
But that would make sense if you had people under you being shot.
Right.
And more than likely dying. You wouldn't want to come back and then have more people under you. It'd be a weird feeling.
Right. And so it got down, at first there were like a dozen, 15 of them, and then it got down, like 10. And then by the end, there were like 5 or 6.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, they kept bringing more guys in, and they didn't make it. It's the more seasoned one who made it. And I remember as a kid, there was the one guy in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, that was older than Dad.
Kept in touch with a couple people.
Yeah, and he would call every once in a while and say, "Is Sarge there?" And you knew it was one of Dad's. And there was another guy that called every once in a while and said, "Is Sarge there?" Because they would call and check on him, and if they needed to talk something through, Dad would listen and give perspective or whatever. But
God, that's so fascinating to me, because I never saw any side of that to him. I always assumed that the day that he got back to America, that was it, and that was the end of the story. I never even understood that he would keep in touch with those type of people.
The ones who made it, some of them kept in touch all the way, and even after Dad died, and after the guy in Coeur d'Alene, who was 3 years older than Dad, died, the widows kept in touch. And Mother had her name in her address book. And of course they're both gone now, but yeah. But that's basically Anzio, and then at some point they wound up getting Monte Cassino, and they pushed up into the hills, and he laid the wire for that, and then other troops came up, and so, it wasn't just the people who were at Anzio were there, and they did get Monte Cassino, but they bombed it. I mean, it was pretty well obliterated, and there were several mountaintop villas along the area that had been bombed out, and the different soldiers went in, and as soldiers do, they plunder. And so one of the things, but Dad was always interesting, everything had to be practical. The one thing that he took from one of the villas was a bedspread for his mother, and he shipped it home to her when he went back. And I've got the bedspread.
Really?
He gave it,
That's
he gave it to me when the kids were little, and we used it on their bed for a while.
Wow.
But they're tiny. The beds were really small.
Right.
And it's in it.
It's got to be an antique.
Yes, I'm sure it is, but it has somewhat stood the test of time, but not totally.
It's funny, the Anzio thing. I just have to say this while we're on this topic, is that when I lived in New Orleans, my roommate Adam, his grandfather was also in the Battle of Anzio. We didn't know that until really the last couple weeks that we lived together, but we've been through a bunch of crazy stuff together, and it's just interesting to me that that it seems like with epigenetics and stuff, it's like him and I kind of found each other where we needed each other. And it's just strange. It was a strange feeling, And I don't know much. There hasn't been a lot of movies about that battle or, anything like that. But I have to imagine it was pretty crazy.
Yes, and the people of that generation, when you say Anzio, it's like whoa, because it really was. I mean, they were establishing a beachhead, and it was
a turning point.
Yes, and it was very bloody, to say the least. But then once they got it, they wound up going into Rome, and Dad had some time to fall back, and one of the things he said, the Basilica at St. Peter's was just phenomenal, and it was the one place out of all the places he saw he really wanted to take Mom, and he never got to do it. It was the one place that he really would have liked her to see. So they wound up going back to Naples and then getting on a ship. And part of their group that had been in Anzio split, and some of them went up through Florence and up around and into France. But his group, they took on a ship, and they landed quicker because you could get there quicker on a ship than you could walking through all of this. And so he went here and then landed here outside of Nice. And this is where he started working with they started working with the French resistance, and this is the area where he started working strictly out of headquarters. He was always, the wire groups were always assigned to headquarters of whatever regiment they were in, because they had to see the maps, and so they had to go in, whoever was the chief went in and had to figure out where they were going, and they would draw maps. And he had, I don't know where they went. He had some little maps that he had drawn of some of the places, looking at the maps up there, so he knew where they were going to go next. And that's where he met with some of the French resistance people. They were in saying, you don't want to go here and you want to go there, and we're going to do this and we will meet you there. And sometimes they would meet him there and sometimes they wouldn't. And so when he got caught with, they always went in twos with the wires. They tried to anyway, other than Anzio, but they tried to go in two, so if one of them got shot, then the other one could bring him back or finish the job or whatever needed to be done. And his buddy got shot behind enemy lines because the French resistance didn't show when they were supposed to have. And they basically were sitting ducks. So that's when they got to the culvert. He was dragging his buddy back, and I think the guy was shot in the leg, if I remember, so he couldn't walk. And the culvert was only big enough that they could both get through, or Dad could get through with his gun and then go back and get him. Well, there was all this fighting going on. He wasn't going back, so he dismantled the gun and threw it and the ammunition in different directions, and then got the buddy back.
Under duress.
Yes.
Boy, it sounds like you saved that guy's life.
So, and he did. And so his commanding officer at 15th Headquarters put him in for another Silver Star, and the French resistance put him in for Croix de Guerre on his own, not just with the regiment. And the Army then said, well, you know, you got rid of equipment. This was a war. You can't leave guns for other people to get. And so they denied the Silver Star. So I always said that he didn't feel like he deserved the one in Anzio because it was damn foolishness, but he deserved it for France. So he'd wear it if he had to. But it meant something different to him than it meant to the Army. And so I don't know that the one from France ever caught up with him with all of that or not, but that's kind of the story there. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was in the fall. It was before the winter with the Battle of the Bulge. I don't think it was snowing at that point in time. But they came up through here, and then the Bulge was in December of 44. And it was in Belgium and France, in this area in here, and Nancy, which I'm sure that's not the way they say it. Dad was south of there and got there 2 weeks after the main fighting of the Bulge. And that's where the Colmar pocket that I sent you, the YouTube video of, that's where they were. They were, the 15th Infantry Regiment was assigned to capture the Rhine. Because if they were cutting off all the supply routes, the main supply route by boat, because the roads they were blowing up, was the Rhine River. Right. And so most of the bridges across the Rhine had been blown up in all of this. They were trying to dismantle it, and they were trying to cut off any supplies that the Germans could get. So they were stationed there, they were bivouacked there trying to cut off the Rhine. And so there was lots of fighting with that too, and that was all like in January, early February of 44. And this is where Dad said that when we went over to Germany in 85, and I said we drove along the Rhine River, it was really pretty. I said, when you want to go back? And he said, I crossed the Rhine 5 times, never on a bridge.
Wow.
And he did. He was he waited it. I mean, with...
In December? I don't even
spring.
see how that's possible.
Spring. It was mostly in January, February, March. It was in spring. It was supposedly the worst winter on record in Europe in a century. And
How would they not have been just
frozen?
Yeah.
Yes, pretty much. I mean, that's
I mean,
yeah. You got across, and you hopefully found a barn or something where you could have a small fire and dry out what you had and move on. I mean, that was the thing he said about France is there were still some barns left in France. There was nothing left anywhere else. And they sometimes could get shelter at least. And then some of the farmhouses in France and then in this part of Germany, when we first got in, the farmers still had a cow or two, and they would have them for breakfast. And he said, but you always had to keep somebody up overnight because sometimes it was a trap. And a lot of times they would offer you their barn, and then the Germans would come and yes. So I think it was in this area. I think it was in Colmar where he got that Luger, but I'm not certain about that. But the fighting was pretty brutal there. And then you can see where they all went here and then down. And this is and somewhere in here is that concentration camp that they. And I don't know which concentration camp, and he very seldom talked about it.
I never heard him mention that. I never knew he'd been to one.
I had never heard about it. I mean, when we were little, before you were born, when we were little, Mom and Dad used to go play pinochle on the weekends, usually a Friday or Saturday night at Grandma and Grandpa's. And Harry and Marguerite were there, and Tommy Joe. And Harry, I think Teddy Roosevelt, larger than life, big stories. He always had lots of stories, and he would talk about the war and fairly glowing terms. And Dad, being Dad, he would never say a whole lot there, but 2 or 3 days later at dinner, he'd say, it wasn't like that. And this is the way it was. And I kind of remember that a little bit from when I was little. And then when I was in college, I took 20th century European history. And I told Dad I was doing that, and that's when he brought out this book. And he said, then if you're going to take that, I can't imagine that World War II isn't going to be a major portion of it. Obviously going to be World War I. But here, there's not a lot of Europe that I didn't see. And, as you're talking about things, so every time I would come home during that semester, he'd say, what are you studying now? And so I would tell him, and then he would fill in, well, that was closer to this battle, and this is here. So I got to hear it as an adult, or a 20-year-old. I don't know, a 20-year adult, but I got to hear it again as a 20-year-old and kind of fill in a few of the gaps. And some of the stories I'd heard, like the Anzio thing I'd heard, over pinochle. But anyway.
Well, the stuff about the Rhine River and the barns in France fascinates me because I'd never heard it. All of this is basically just gray area for me. Like, I know that he ended up. This is the whole point of why I wanted to hear all this, is because I never could picture any of these things. I like filling these gaps of crossing the river and finding barns and knowing that they could be traps and things like that.
There were lots of traps.
It just fascinates me that he made it through all this stuff. I mean, a
third of being injured.
Yeah, being injured or killed. I mean, a third of your time behind enemy lines, 2 years and 8 months, is a long time.
Well, I think the wire chief job, other than the managing people and worrying about them, really fit him pretty well because he could think on his feet and he could reason, and he was very logical about things, and he sized up things quickly and could move on them. And I don't know how well he took orders, but I think that a lot of what he had to do behind enemy lines was, okay, this is the goal, and you need to get here, and we don't care how you get there. Right. And so he could do that. Yep. And so I think it fit his personality quite well.
Makes sense.
He found his niche.
Right.
And where driving a truck, I don't think he ever would have found his niche. But
it sounds like he had a little bit of leeway to make his own way.
By the time he got to France, and there were no more lieutenants, and he was the senior man, and they called him in, and one particular officer knew that he'd been an Anzio, and he just turned to him and saying, "What do you think?" And Dad said, "Well, I think we do this or that," and they just kind of let him once he got into France a ways, they just let him have it and said, okay, this is where we want to go, and go do it.
Yeah, and that fills in a lot of the gaps for me, because I've always thought that he was like in a regiment and they would say, you know, we're doing this, you go here, and so I always pictured him basically just dodging bullets. I never understood that he would have some sort of flexibility to figure out his way through.
Well, he was dodging bullets. There's no doubt about that, because he was behind enemy lines, and then once you laid the wire and you went back, then you had to go through the front line, back through. So there's all this going crossfire back and forth through the front lines, and so yeah, he was dodging bullets, but his mission wasn't to kill, but he could, and he did, from what I understand, if his life was in danger. I mean, or if somebody was on the enemy side was endangering the operation, then yes, you did. But he wasn't on the front lines. So in that sense, if you could reason things well, and if you were damn lucky, as he would say, then you came through it fairly well. But you had to use your head. You couldn't not do it. But they came through Germany and south of Frankfurt, and then down to Munich, and then Berchtesgaden, which I'm never sure how to pronounce it. I don't know. But it's the town where Hitler's home, where the Eagle's Nest was, is where he was on May 8th.
Is that where Hitler died?
No, Hitler died in Berlin.
Okay. I've never been
They
sure.
thought, Dad said when they got there, they thought he might be there. And there was a group ahead of him that had come in from a different direction, and they were there first. And when they got there, that group said, no, he's not here. And they got the news that it was over, that Hitler was dead. And that's when they set up the little sign, and it said Hitler's home, and then they started taking pictures.
And is that where he got that gigantic flag?
I don't know where he got the gigantic flag.
Because it was huge.
I know.
It was huge.
Bigger than a regular flag?
Yeah, I feel like it was...
A Nazi? It had to be over a headquarters of some sort.
Over something substantial. Because
And I don't know that it was... I doubt if it was Eagle's Nest, because the other group got there first. I would think they would have taken things, but it could have been anywhere south of the Colmar. Once they got across the Rhine for the last time, because they went back and forth. Once they got across the Rhine, they were in German territory. So it could have been anywhere in here.
So you said he got there on May 8th, but wasn't the war over in late April?
That was May 8th was the surrender date. And that's when the Germans surrendered. And I think Hitler killed himself 3 days ahead of time. So it's early May, and I'm not sure when. I don't know if he's marked on the pictures when it was taken exactly, but it's got to be early May, because I know once May 8th was done, they went on from there, and they counted it they count Central Europe as a campaign. I think that's what they're talking about, Salzburg, because he flew out of Salzburg, and they wanted him to stay and then help with the rebuilding. And he said, look, I can't have been here this long and fought these people and killed them and expect to turn around and help them rebuild. That's a whole nother skill set, and that's not something I can do, and I've got more time in than anybody else here, and I'm going home. So he was like on the second plane out of there. So they offered him Master Sergeant, and he said, you can offer me a title all you want to, but I'm out of here. So he took Tech Sergeant, and he flew home. So he mustered out in July of 45 at Fort Leavenworth.
So when he was in France, was that occupied at that time?
Yes.
The whole time he was there?
They were pushing the Germans out of there.
Okay. And how long was he in France for? Because that's the thing that I've heard is that he did something through a sewer in France, and wriggled through a sewer to get out somewhere.
That's the story. That's the culvert.
Oh, that's the culvert.
Yeah, culvert, sewer. It's the thing that goes under the road.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, that's it. That's the one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he was not in Paris. He did not liberate Paris.
Sure.
I mean, he went up this way and around. The ones who liberated Paris are the guys who were in Normandy.
Okay.
And Bulge. They were in that because they came in from the north, and he came in from the south, and he was on the eastern side. He talked about walking around Switzerland and the fact that, they were in the mountains high, and they looked down and there were lights. He had not seen lights at night since they left the States.
Wow.
because
That's crazy.
because if you turned on lights, you got bombed.
Right.
But Switzerland was neutral.
Mhm.
And he said, wow, I mean, it just really hit him. It was, sizable, because it's a sizable area to walk
Yeah,
around.
definitely.
So it was a couple, 3 weeks that they were walking around all this area and doing things, and they look down every night and there's lights. It just,
I think about how daunting that would be all those years at night, no light, and people might be shooting at you.
yeah.
It would
And
be-
behind it,
would be-
and it wasn't like he went out for the day and just came back at 5, it wasn't an 8 to 5 job. A lot of times behind enemy lines, you got back there and you couldn't get where they needed to, and so you just kind of find a spot and bivouac in and hope nobody found you, and, in the morning, pick it up again and see if you could get the wire where it's supposed to go. I mean, it was a totally different time because somebody cut the wire and the Army didn't move because they couldn't go beyond where the wire went. Or you could, but it didn't work well.
When they were in Germany, how long were they in Germany for, do you think?
They were in Colmar, which is right on the German, French, Belgian border, Liechtenstein border, in January, February of 45, and then he was out of there. May 8th was when the war ended in 45.
Gotcha.
So they were in late winter and spring of 45 in Germany.
So when they left Anzio, were they, because they didn't participate in the Battle of the Bulge and things like that. I'm trying to understand what their mission was. Was it just to get into Germany and basically kind of infiltrate?
Well, their
Germany?
mission originally was to come up Italy and take Italy. And Rome was the first capital to fall of the Axis armies, and he was involved in that. And so, there's a big celebration, the fact that Rome fell. And so, okay, we got Italy, but now we're going to have to push back and get rid of the Germans and the Italians up here that still, I mean, this was pretty well safe. The southern part of Germany, the north wasn't. And so they divided the forces, and they sent part of them up Italy because they figured at this point in time they're pulling back. And so it's not going to be the big thrust forward, and we need to bring part of them over here because D-Day had happened in June of 45 here, and they landed in August of 45 down here. And so now we're going to push from both sides, from north and south, towards the east to come together to come into Germany and push the Germans out of France was the whole point of that.
Do you know where he would have been when Paris was liberated? Or
I don't. I honestly don't.
just curious.
I assume somewhere down here between Lyon and...
Not terribly far, but not
No,
there.
I don't. No, he wasn't. To the best of my knowledge,
Not the-
he was not in Paris. I don't know.
Yeah, it looks like it was pretty far east of it.
I know he was never really fond of the French resistance. He was never a fan of de Gaulle. Back when we were little and de Gaulle was the president of France, he said, can't believe him. I mean...
He's a pretty notorious politician. you
Yeah.
know.
So he just didn't. So, he came home and he mustered out, and then he took his money, which I think was interesting. He had a total pay of $1,936.31.
Wow.
And he banked it. That was his down payment on the home. That was he was gonna do. And everybody was trying to find a job, and the soldiers came back. There's a couple stories that I didn't even hear from Dad. I heard once I was at South. Came home, as you imagine, soldiers coming back and they're all trying to get a job and they're happy to be home and safe, and American Legion and VFW had reunions and they would all get drunk and do stuff. Dad never did any of that. But
Really?
No. The guy that lived across the street from him on Wabash, who had gone, they'd gone in together, and he had gone to the Pacific front, had taken shrapnel to the head on a ship. And he wasn't ever right. And so, guys being guys, they would go out and get him drunk, and then somebody would call Dad to come get him.
Oh, wow.
And so Dad would go get him. And there was a couple stories that I didn't hear from Dad, but I heard once I went to South, a lot of the folks, it seems like the parents, I would go and you'd go with somebody to somebody's house and they'd say Hazlett, and they'd say, oh, Buck or Roy. They all knew Dad and his cousin, who was Howard Benjamin, was Buck. Well, Buck was kind of the party guy and Dad was not. And the stories that I got, and it was more than one that I got it from, was that whenever this guy would get in trouble, then Dad would always show up to take him home and sober him up, and you're being made fun of and don't do that, and they're just egging you on. And one time it was at the Mulebach, which, if you remember, the Mulebach, it had the 3 posts. Well, the guy was out on the flagpole. They somehow or another got this guy out on the flagpole, and he was hanging on, and Dad went out on the flagpole and pulled him in and brought him home. And then there's a little place over, if you go down 79th from Mount Olivet to go over to where Grandma and Grandpa are buried on Hillcrest, there's a curve, and there's a little brown tavern. It's been there forever. It's had several different names. It's over on the south side. And supposedly the story goes, and I've heard this one again, 3 different places, is that they got this guy drunk at this tavern. And Dad went in, and the guy wasn't very big, and Dad picked him up and threw him over his shoulder. And they said, "Oh, Roy, let him be. We're just having a good time." And Dad reached over and grabbed a bottle and slammed it on the bar and said, "Come get him if you want him," and backed out.
Wow.
I assume there's some sort of truth to those stories because I heard them from more than one, but I don't know. And it wasn't anything that I ever heard at Grandma and Grandpa's. It was never anything that Dad talked about. It was just people who knew Dad and Buck, when they would hear the name, would ask. And I heard it actually at my 45th class reunion. Somebody came up to me and said, "There's a question I've always wanted to know." One of the guys, "Hazlett?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Buck or Roy?" And I said, "Roy." Badass. I was like, whatever. Just whatever. But
He was very fortunate to have lived through all of that.
yes.
Extremely.
Did he ever talk about his friends that he lost there? Did he ever talk about anybody that he lost?
The one time when we were talking about France, and we were talking about the end of the war, and he talked about the guy that got shot, and he at least went stateside when he was done. But then right afterwards, one or the other one got killed, and Dad vowed that he wasn't going to lose any more, because there was like down to 5 of them at that point.
Right.
And he wasn't going to lose any more. And he said he was very proud of the fact that they made it through and they didn't lose any of them.
Wow.
But he said it took a lot. He said there were a lot of times where I would have gone out and done some things and maybe done them a little differently, but I had to stand back and look at, okay, what's best for the men, and I don't want to put them in any kind of danger, and so we're going to do this a little bit different. And so sometimes it took a little longer than what headquarters would want, but he wanted to make sure that they all came back.
Yeah. Didn't you have something happen to his legs? I feel like
We talked about that I remember in the summers when he would mow the lawn, afterwards sometimes he would pull his pants legs up. It was the only time I ever saw his legs, and his legs had scars on them, and it never occurred to me till maybe 5 years ago to wonder why he had scars on his legs.
Well, that was from crawling on the ground.
Do you think that's what it was?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Because he talked about, I think it was Anzio, but I wouldn't swear to it. He had a big gash, and he had to fall back and had to have stitches on the gash. And it was when they were going to Monte Cassino. They had established a beachhead and moved in, and he had to fall back, and he actually got a hot meal in a shower, and he looked down and it was bleeding. He was going, "Oh, okay." So then he had to have stitches, and so he actually fell back for about a week, and that's when they measured him for boots again, because he was back there because they wouldn't put him back on the front until it was healed enough to go back on the front. And then the boots never caught up to him. He said he finally got a pair of boots just as he was getting on the plane, and he pitched them. And he didn't wait for a plane with seats. He went with some of the equipment. He said, he started, he said, they said, "Well, we have one that has seat." And they said, "Well," he said, "I started with a truck, I'm going to end with a truck." And so he said he flew back with his back to the tires, to the wheel of a truck. Because he just said he just wanted out of there. It was...
You can understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, you spend that long and... No.
When you mentioned earlier that you might have had to kill people, is that just because of the situation, you think? I'm sure you never obviously talked about anything like that.
When it's, I see, when it's him or me.
I just asked because I always got that feeling that, like, he had that ability, but obviously never said.
I don't know how many times it happened. I
Sure,
don't think
sure.
it happened many.
Yeah.
I think maybe a couple.
I mean, it's just obviously a morbid curiosity of what really happened, you know.
I think it was probably in France, but I wouldn't swear to it
That makes sense.
because they did get ambushed.
Mm-hmm.
Anzio,
In what way were they ambushed?
they were on these missions to move things forward, and then the French were supposed to do some things, and sometimes the French would set them up. I mean, they were playing two ends against the middle, and so sometimes they'd set them up and they get ambushed.
Gotcha.
And then I think Colmar might have been that may have been another one when they were going across the Rhine back and forth. I think there was something there. And I think that's when he took the Luger, would be my guess, but I don't know that for sure.
Interesting.
But, by that point in time, he said, I'm pretty hardened to all of it.
Sure, yeah.
You don't go out looking to kill people, but if they're going to kill you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's honestly, I mean, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's honestly one of the most fascinating things to me is that I think a lot of this stuff is generational because you have people coming back from, Iraq and Afghanistan, things like that, and they're dealing with a lot of stress and they are seeing things they shouldn't see, but they're not dealing with, literally thousands of people dying in a short span of time. You know what I mean?
Well, PTSD, I think, PTSD wasn't called PTSD.
It's like shell shock.
It was shell shock, yeah. And so, like his buddy who had had the injury and they had shell shock, I mean, there were a lot of people who had shell shock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think Dad just turned it in. I think he thought about it. I think he probably dreamed about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes he'd awake in his chair and he'd just jump.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see he was tensed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might have been part of it. But
yeah, you said that your mom would say that he had dreams sometimes and things like that.
I would say that might be accurate.
And
she just didn't want to hear about it. She'd heard about it. He needed to talk. Probably all needed counseling.
I feel like in general he didn't want to talk about it. That he did not want to talk about it.
He didn't. I don't think he wanted to share it and upset people. And
I always felt like it was something he didn't want to glorify.
Right.
Even when I would ask him about the metal, like, he taught me how to shoot a gun, a bow, all this stuff. But when it would come to this stuff, it was just off the table. It wasn't even.
Well, and some of that is because of when you were there. Because Harry was my cousin Tom's dad, and Harry used to glorify a lot of things, and my cousin Tom wasn't the sharpest crayon on the box. Don't put that out on the air. And his mother really stifled him. She wouldn't let him go out of his front yard until he was in high school, and even then maybe not. And so he joined the Marines in Vietnam. He was going to be a man, and he stepped on a landmine. And Dad somehow or another always blamed himself for that. He thought that if he'd shut off Harry from all the conversations and he felt like by not saying anything, he encouraged him, that Tom might not have joined, at least not the Marines. I mean, he just, watching Dad in Vietnam, it was America right or wrong when we were kids. And then watching everything on the news at night, and then especially after Tom died, why are we in this war? I mean, he just...
Yeah, I was always curious about his feelings about that.
Complicated, I would say.
I think so. There was a time period, the deferments in those days were 4 years, and Richard's engineering program was 5, and we were scheduled to get married the December of my senior year. And they drew numbers in those days, and Richard had like 29 or something. Well, his deferment ended that summer at the end of his 4th year. He still had the 5th year for engineering. Well, in September he was called up.
Oh, wow.
So he went for his physical, and Dad was like, well, if I have to, I'll just drive you to Canada.
Really?
I mean, yes. He even had the route planned. He got out the map and showed me where we could cross the border in North Dakota.
Well, yeah, see, that's an important thing to know,
It's just, he had waited a long time. He'd not talked about it at all. I was home. I mean, we had the invitations and were ready to go, and he pulled it out and he said, if it comes to this, this is what we're going to do. And I was like, whoa. As it turned out, Richard has all kinds of asthma and hay fever, and his allergist that he'd had from the time he was a baby was a colonel in the reserves, and he said he wrote a letter saying this man would jeopardize anybody in his platoon in Vietnam, because he's allergic to everything in Vietnam, and so he and based upon the fact with an allergist, a regular allergist probably wouldn't have got it, but since he was a colonel in reserves and he signed it as the colonel, then Richard was 4F. So
Interesting.
So I don't know what would have happened. We've all often talked about the fact we would be Canadian at this point. If it
Probably
had.
a little bit better off. You never know.
Well, we'd have universal health
There
care.
you go.
I mean, so I don't know. Sometimes I think the smoking in the basement, when we were little.
Was related to that. It may have been.
Yeah, I think so.
I was going to say one thing that I wanted to say before we stopped was how funny it struck me when we went to that World War II museum, and I saw that flashlight that was in our cabinet in the kitchen for my entire childhood that I always thought was a work flashlight, and they had it in World War II museum. It was something a GI would have carried with them,
Right.
and it meant that he carried that for like almost 3 years, and he never mentioned that it was just the flashlight.
Yeah, it was the
Yeah, but it's
Stone cold.
it was just they all.
I never realized that it was anything special
And I don't even know where the flashlight is.
Well, I don't either, because we didn't know. We didn't know.
I think Richard may have it. I'm not sure.
You could put it in a museum at this point.
Probably. I had never seen the Wireman's case until I went to the World War II museum in New Orleans, and then they had basically what the pouch that he did in the wire and the spools, and that was really interesting to see.
Yeah, I bet.
But it was very similar. He came back, and because he'd been a wireman, then he applied to Southwestern Bell and got on, and he was a lineman. Still string on wire, but yeah, that's how he wound up in Bell all those years.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. So he comes back from the war, and then he meets Grandma.
Grandma worked at the public library, and Louise Tarfelli, who was Dad's foster sister, which is a whole nother. She also worked at the library, and Louise brought Mom home for dinner, and that's how he met her.
Wow, which library?
Downtown Kansas City, the main library. Mom worked in.
It would have been someplace else.
Yeah.
No, it was someplace else. I remember it in high school. I went there. Mom worked in the magazine area.
Really?
Yeah, so she always had magazines everywhere.
That's true.
Well, that's where she worked. She worked in the magazine area, and she worked with Louise. Yeah, and then Louise.
There you go. There's epigenetics. That's funny.
Louise, Grandma Hazlett's parents ran a truck garden in Dotson, and Dotson was the railroad that went into the farmers market in Kansas City, and so all that bottom area there was vegetables and fruit and whatever for the summer, and so there were always people down there picking things and putting them on the cars, and they would go into the farmers market to be sold then the next day. That was how they made their living, was truck garden. And so a lot of people in the 30s who didn't have any place to go would ride the rails, and they would get off wherever there was some place to work, and that's Louise got off, and she worked there some, and she also Velma worked someplace else, and I'm not sure, it wasn't a truck garden, but it was down 85th Street, according to Barbara, when I talked to her this summer, and Louise worked there too. Louise was Italian, and she had come over, her father had died in World War I, and her mother, and she was like 4. And in the old country, what they did is if a older brother died, the younger brother married the widow. Well, the younger brother had immigrated, and he was in New Mexico, in Raton, New Mexico, and just on the other side of Colorado. And so she went there and she married him. Well, turns out, according to Barbara, and I would say this is probably accurate, he was cruel to them. And so as soon as Louise was old enough to strike out on her own. She hopped a railroad car with everybody else and just came through El Paso and up through Texas and area and just working her way until she found some place. And Grandma and Grandpa always had in their basement, which was dirt and gravel, if you remember, there was a little bit of concrete. They always had cots, and some of the workers would come and sleep there.
Oh, wow.
So if you look at the census from 20 and 30 and 40, you'll see lodgers, and there are people who were sleeping on the cots when the census people came through. And Louise did that, and she just stayed. And in the end, they treated her like a daughter. She wound up buying the house next to them.
Wow.
She took care of them when in their old age. I mean, she was, for all intents and purposes, a daughter.
That's
they just
incredible.
never formally adopted her. She's buried next to him.
Wow.
And so she's the one who introduced.
Did you guys meet her? You knew her?
Oh, yeah, we knew Louise.
Yeah.
Little Italian cookies every Christmas.
Yes, very definitely.
That's hilarious.
She worked with Grandpa.
She was a tough cookie.
Well, if you're going to ride the rails,
She seemed like somebody who could have ridden the rail.
and she did, but
Bite on that nickel.
you survive. If you didn't survive, you died.
Right.
And she was a survivor, and she did. So I don't know. She just was, but she was always good to them, and they were good to her. And like family Thanksgiving, she was always there.
Mm-hmm.
It was just Louise. She just had a different last name.
Right.
Who knew? I mean, I never really knew the story. Barbara told me she came out of Raton. I knew she'd gone through El Paso because Grandma and Grandpa and Louise used to go to El Paso every once in a while. There was somebody there that they would visit. But Barbara said she went with Louise on the train to Raton to visit her mom when she was little. So.
My only other question was just if you ever mentioned anything about the German people or the Nazis or anything, or the French people or the Italian people.
The Italians.
What about the Italian?
Well, that he hated garlic.
Yes, he did.
Really?
A lifelong hatred of garlic,
Really?
which I think was common to people who have been. Jeff has talked about his stepdad hating garlic, hating the smell of garlic. That it was, maybe it was because it was in the air, and that was, I don't know, and it was.
Dad he didn't like Italian food at all, any way,
Didn't
shape, or
have
form.
anything to do with it.
Really?
Nothing. So like sometimes they get called out, linemen get called out when there's ice storms and tornadoes and whatever. And so when he went to St. Louis one time, they went to the Hill in St. Louis, which is a big Italian area, and they fed him. I mean, they didn't even have to pay, and Dad just refused to eat it. It didn't matter; it was free. He wasn't eating it.
I remember that you hated Japanese cars. I'm serious.
That's a whole different thing. Well, maybe not.
No, it's not a whole different thing. But I mean, the French he never trusted because they.
Who does?
No, who does?
He felt like some of them were okay, but you really couldn't trust them all the time.
Sure.
And he lost some buddies because of it, and he drugged the one guy back because of it, and he just never really trusted him. The German people, by that point in time, he never understood why they would back Hitler. So it'd be interesting to see what he would think now with all the politics. But the Nazis by the end, they were just, the people he was fighting were just, they were fighting just like them. I mean, everybody was trying to survive. The one thing that I think was really interesting is through Germany, because there were actually some places to sleep, and in the barns, and they were feeding him. They would make him pancakes sometimes because they had some milk and they had some wheat and they could make something. So Mom said after they got married and she served pancakes the first morning. He said, "Where's the peanut butter?" Mother said, "Oh, because it's a German thing, I guess." She grew up with it too, and she said, "I thought I was getting away from it, but that was the one thing he brought back from Germany he really liked was peanut butter on pancakes."
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
We still eat.
Yeah, we still eat peanut butter on pancakes too. It's just, I don't know. There's so many other things I'm sure that if you could get him talking, he talked to you a little bit when you were doing a paper on World War II.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't something he talked about.
Did he ever keep in touch with the man that he took through that culvert?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Honestly, don't know if he was the other guy. There were two of them called Dad
Oh, yeah.
that you knew when answered, because I always had to answer phone because he He taught us to lie. But if the bell would call and he was on call, he's not home, So he would never answer the phone because he didn't want to go out at crazy hours. And so I would answer the phone a lot of times. And if it was for Sarge, then I knew it was Dad. And you just figured that they were going to be on the phone an hour or so. And that was in long distance times when it cost a lot. And you didn't call unless it was something pretty major. So I don't know who the other guy was. I know the one is the guy who was a little bit older from Coeur d'Alene. That they actually drove out and visited him one time. Somewhere we found a matchbook from Coeur d'Alene.
And Grandma was pretty much over it by the time you'd come along. You guys would come along.
Grandma was, as far as...
Well, you said that she was tired of hearing the stories and things like that. It sounds like he got a lot of this stuff off his chest to her.
Probably early on when I don't remember.
Right.
The first memory I have of anything talking about the war was the pinochle games, because Tom and I, we were small enough, we'd play jacks under the kitchen table. With a ball, jacks.
Yeah.
We were playing jack until we would fall asleep, and then somebody'd pick us up and take us. So I was like 4, maybe 5. I wasn't very old.
I was just always curious of her perception of him and his time during that time, because when I came around, it seemed like she just was over it.
She was over it. By the time we moved to the new house, which is the house you all remember, didn't hear it. She just didn't want to hear it. And so even when I was in college, he would pick a time to talk about what I was studying in class when she was gone to the hairdresser or she wasn't around. He just wasn't going to bring it up.
Yeah.
I do remember when he, at the very end of his life, when he fell and he was paralyzed and he was going through physical therapy, and she kept insisting that he would get over that and he would be able to walk again because he could deal with anything.
Wow.
And I think that's part of where that came from, was that idea that he lived through all of that, and she had complete faith that, if there was a way to deal with that, he would find it. And
I think we all had that faith.
I remember her saying that, well, he'll get over this. And, it wasn't that simple.
I remember you saying that she always thought she was going to go first.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we all thought that.
Well,
she's
was always sick.
She's the one who had all the health issues. He was always healthy. And she's right. I think we all felt that. Dad was indestructible in our eyes.
Yeah, to me, for sure. He's still, to me, the strongest man I've ever met. It's like, I don't
Well, the hands were huge, and even the guy at the funeral parlor said, when they said 80-year-old man, he expected a shriveled guy. He said, did he play football? I didn't expect to pick up a linebacker.
Yeah.
He was in very good shape. He was he was a 12-pound baby. He was big. It's on his. I've got the birth.
His birth certificate.
It's in here.
12 pounds.
12 pounds is what it says.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, it's in here. I got all this stuff in here.
But he wasn't he was just a well proportioned.
He was
strong, but not huge.
No, he wasn't huge, and not fat. I remember him. There was a time period he weighed about 240, and that was when he went down on his back, which I was in 7th grade, and he decided he was taking it off. That's all there is to it.
What was it you told me that he had to do exercises for something?
For that, when he slipped, did he slip a disc in his back?
He slipped a disc in his back.
They gave him at that time, he was in traction for a couple of weeks, and he
was
was
in
the
Baptist.
sole provider of the family.
Yes,
so
he was.
I'm sure, oh my gosh.
Here's his.
Maybe that's not even correct.
Here's
He weighs
his.
12 pounds of.
According to Marguerite, it was 13.
Oh, no.
But Marguerite always tended to exaggerate a few things. That
a baby or a brick?
And that doesn't go on either. I think the assumption was that Grandma maybe had gestational diabetes, and that tends to make the baby bigger. But she couldn't have any kids after him.
100 years old.
That ended it. They said that.
Well, he was her youngest child.
Yes, and they said she could not have any more children after him.
So when he had that back injury, they gave him exercises then.
Yes.
And told him do these, and he did them every day.
Well, and that's when he went to work at Bendix, because he could no longer climb poles. And Bendix in those days was making things for the Vietnam War, and now there's class action suits for bladder cancer, which is what he had, because they think that it was nuclear and.
Well, there's always been the stories that they're holding nuclear bombs underneath those sites.
You know, the thing about it is with Dad, because
Entirely possible because they're all over the place.
they had put 4 other people up for that job, and when you were in charge, it's like a small city. When you're in charge of the phones for the small city, you're everywhere. And so you had to have level 4 security clearance, which is like right below top secret, and nobody could pass it. And so they finally, when Dad was injured, they said, well, anybody could pass it, he should be able to. And the FBI came, and Maxine was in her element because they interviewed her for like a half hour. And
Classic.
he passed it. But and all that time he never talked about anything he saw.
No, I never heard
That was part of it.
Word.
No.
Literally, I never thought about it.
No, he never talked. And that was part of it. He could not talk about anything he saw.
I don't remember him ever speaking anything about it. That's funny.
It's like they're right to trust it.
Yeah, I guess so.
And they gave him a really, his title was like maintenance. It was really a low level title. And so when I went through Rush at Mizzou, they asked what your father does, and I said maintenance. So I get to the Pi-Fi house, and the Pi-Fis say, why do you think that a janitor's daughter should be a Pi-Fi? And I'm like, what?
Burn.
I mean, no. What? It didn't even dawn on me, And later, somebody said something about it, and I said, well, I bet your dad doesn't have a level 4 security clearance. I mean, and he says,
It
well,
was
it's
a
your
cover
dad
the whole
too.
time, Janet.
Anyway.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me about this. I really appreciate it.
And I'll probably think of 10 other things after we're done.
I need to take a picture of the map there.
Yes, you
and
do need to
probably
take a picture.
That document there.
Oh, yes, is DD 214.
I doubt it.
Thank you for caring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dad, wherever you are, I hope I did you justice. And we're done.